Thank you very much for that intro. And now let's see if I can pull up my slides and we'll start right off. Just a moment. There we go. Okay, I've got a title here. Let me start off with this first. I got an audacious title, I'm sure, for many people. It may sound a little bit unreal, but I really mean it. I've been involved in this field for a long time. And one of my principal concerns has been really concerned with what nutrition is, how do we define it, what is good nutrition, and so forth. And I've really been, I have to say, rather disappointed when I look at the history leading up to this present day, as well as looking at the way we talk about nutrition these days. And I just want to go right to the point and talk about some of the issues that I think are standing in the way of this problem. As was mentioned in the intro, I need to just present a couple of little points here for background for what I'm going to say in a moment. I was a graduate student at Cornell University. I did my master's and doctoral dissertation on the question concerning advancing the consumption of more animal protein. That was supposed to be good. Subsequently, I was then responsible for coordinating a program in the Philippines for the State Department when I was at Virginia Tech to basically to develop a model for feeding malnourished children. They were supposed to get more protein, and what I really saw there at the time was rather striking in a sense that it was almost the opposite of what we're supposed to do. Here it goes right here. There was a study in India. This is a study by people in India looking at the effect of protein on the formation of liver cancer in regards to the level of protein intake. I had saw it, in fact, in my work in the Philippines, that the children who were malnourished, the few who were getting the most protein, not many, just a few, they seem to have a higher likelihood of getting liver cancer. And so with this study here, I'm showing it here from India at that time, it seemed to coincide with what my impression was, namely, when people consume more animal protein, or protein, as was said in those days, the more liver cancer they got. This study here, in fact, shows just a very simple sort of representation of an animal study published in 1968, whereby rats, in this particular case, exposed to a chemical carcinogen that gives rise to liver cancer, then fed two different levels of protein. What they saw was really striking. Quite frankly, they didn't believe their own research, and I had a hard time believing it too, that the animals fed the higher levels of protein, 20% of total calories, all of them got the liver cancer. The others fed 5%, none did. Striking, really striking. I mean, it suggested rather dramatically that increase in animal protein consumption increased the production of this particular kind of cancer. So I came home, organized this study, went on for many years, decades, in fact, looking at this question, is it really true? I mean, I didn't quite want to believe that, to be honest about it, but we had to kind of stick with the science, with what we saw. And here's was one plot that's relevant to this question. I thought this was pretty striking. This is basically the development of cancer over the first 12 weeks after the gene has been mutated by that carcinogen. Okay, so what we're looking at here over 12 weeks is the growth of the cancer in regard to 20% dietary protein. There it is for 5%. In other words, I was saying the same thing here what the Indian workers had reported that they didn't want to believe. I mean, this again, it's a really striking effect. Then we did some other kinds of studies, and I think in this particular case, many of you may have seen this, I found this here particularly poignant. Animals fed 20% for the first 3 weeks. They're growing their cancers, if you will. We switched it to 5%. The cancer turned off. In spite of the so-called mutation, in spite of the chemical carcinogen. So this was a demonstration of the fact that the cancers grew when they were fed the higher levels of protein. And we could turn it on and turn it off just by adjusting protein intake. Once again, that was really striking. It suggested, for one thing, that nutrition, rather than genes, primarily control cancer development. Another big ticket item. to be honest about it. I mean, diet playing that kind of role instead of the chemicals that started, if you will, or the genes that started. So with all that sort of running around in my head and some others too, my colleagues didn't particularly think was smart by going down this particular path to say that animal protein could cause cancer, or protein, if you will. So one of the things we did in those days, and still a lot of people do it these days, is in order to explain something that is so striking and so opposing what we tend to think, we have to look for the mechanisms by which this works. And this is my attempt to look at mechanisms. This proceeded over maybe 10, 12, almost 15 years, I guess you could say. And what I'm going to show you right here is that cancer, from a research point of view, is divided into three parts. The first part is initiation. That's when the cancers are forming right here in the early stages. And then we go through a stage of many months, maybe years, in the case of humans, where these new cancer cells that are formed right here, this dotted line, they'll start dividing and going forward. And finally, you get to a place where the tumor is noticed. And at that particular point, the second dotted line, that's in the case of humans, that's when they see they've got something and they tend to get diagnosed. At that particular point in time, these cancer cells, which have been growing rather well, suddenly decide to get a little mischievous and they go to other tissues, that is, the metastasize. So this last stage here is kind of dangerous. The cancer now has spread, as they say, and it needs to be treated quickly. So anyhow, that's the scheme that we researchers use to try to understand cancer. The first stage here, we call it initiation. That's the stage during which the mutation is formed. By mutation, I'm talking about a chemical coming in and binding to the DNA, the stuff of genes, and corrupting the DNA. And we have a way of repairing that almost automatically because it goes on every second of our lives. We have a way of repairing that, and that's called DNA repair. But in any case, that's enough said there. I just want to walk you through some mechanisms. I, at that time, was primarily in pharmacology. I was actually in two professions as far as research is concerned. One was in pharmacology, the other was in nutrition. I don't know why I was so silly to have two professions at the time, but I was focused on pharmacological approaches to understanding things like cancer. And in that case, we tend to want to work on from a biochemical level to see what's going on. So in any case, after seeing this effect of the protein on the cancer, I was looking for the mechanism. Because if we can find the mechanism responsible for this, then the idea is, at least in pharmacology or in the drug world, if we can identify the key mechanism, then we maybe can find a chemical, we'll call it a drug, that we can take and block it so we don't like it. That's the idea. So I started looking for mechanisms. And this went on to say for some years, usually each one of these studies involves 3 or 4 years, and it usually involved a graduate student getting a PhD, some cases a little bit shorter. Here's what we found. First off, the high protein diet increases the rate at which the carcinogen, that starts things, it increases the rate at which the carcinogen comes into the cell. Okay, that sounded pretty interesting. I mean, when I first sort of saw that, then say, well, why don't we just find some chemical to block its entry into the cell? So that was so-called mechanism number one. Then another student came along. We started looking at some other things, and when the carcinogen gets inside of cells, it then is metabolized by an enzyme called mixed function oxidase. That enzyme actually. Sorry about that. I'll turn off my phone. When the carcinogen comes into the cell, then it's metabolized to hopefully some detoxified product. But in the process, it actually it spins off some nasty little chemical, unintended, that's quite toxic. That enzyme that does all of that is called mixed function oxidase. And it's a very complex enzyme system, by the way, made of different parts. But the high protein diet increased the synthesis of that enzyme. Okay? What that meant is that, so if it increases the synthesis of that enzyme, then the enzyme is going to be turning on the activation of that carcinogen. It's going to turn on faster, and the process of turning on that reaction. some of these sort of mischievous sort of side reactions going to occur, some kind of dangerous chemicals spill out. That was mechanism number two. Then we also learned too that this enzyme being a very complex system made of different parts, we learned that in fact all these different parts actually rearrange themselves in a way in which also increased the enzyme activity. Once again, the high protein diet rearranged things to make the enzyme producing more active product, if you will. Okay, we got three now. Now at this particular point in time, as I say, that reaction goes forward. It's kind of detoxifying the carcinogen. That's its main purpose. But we got this little side stream coming off the side, this dangerous chemical called an epoxide is forming. That chemical then is so reactive that it essentially binds to the DNA in the cell. Now, the DNA is the stuff of genes. So when the carcinogen product binds to the DNA, that starts the reaction called a mutation, okay? Just tightly coupled. The enzyme, the high protein diet increased the amount of that reactant binding to the DNA. Wow, that was pretty impressive. That was dose responsive, so it was really impressive there. That was mechanism number four. Then in turn, usually under normal circumstances, even with we're sitting here talking and so forth and so on, we got this kind of stuff going on all the time, but we got a mechanism in our bodies that's called DNA repair. So that's another mechanism sitting there to take care of things, kind of fail-safe kind of mechanism. That's a good one. That should be high. The high protein diet actually decreased it. I mean, it's turning all these others on to increase the likelihood of cancer. This isn't a good one. It actually knocked it down. So then we went to the next stage called promotion. In the second stage here, now, once the cell comes from this first stage to the second stage, most of the so-called early cancer cells are destroyed. But a little escapes through. They come out and they're ready to go. They're called pre-neoplastic. They have the properties of being able to grow into cancer. At that point in time, our immune system comes into play, produces a lot of cells and so forth and so on, and it can kill these early cancer cells. That's the idea. Again, we have that mechanism as a fail-safe mechanism. We call it natural killer cells coming from the immune system. And so it's a good thing. Those should be produced. The high protein diet, like the DNA repair, it turned out to do something exactly. It decreased those cells. It ruined their ability to be able to kill the cancer cell. Okay, that's what is that? That's number 7 or number 6 actually. Number of mechanism here. Then the high protein diet comes along and it increases some. And again, a very complicated system, but it increases the biochemistry in such a way that it increases the rate at which these cancer cells divide. Wow. So now the high protein diet turned on these cancer cells, they're dividing, like, that's what I show here. Then another thing the high protein diet does, it increases the production of what we call the oxygen-free radicals. These are reactive oxygen species. If there are any biochemists in the crowd, reactive oxygen species, ROS, those kind of little substances nasty. They tend to increase aging. They tend to increase cancer. High protein diet increase the production of that too. And the high protein diet increase this hormone here that's associated with cancer. Mind you, this was done 30, 40 years ago. So there wasn't much known at that time about any of these things. So I'm saying here, high protein, turn on that enzyme. And then, in the most complicated of all these mechanisms, the high protein diet changed the way in which calories are used. If we have an excess of calories, we tend to spur cancer growth. So again, the high protein diet rearranged all that body of mechanisms. I'll call it one just for the sake of argument here. And the high protein diet turned on that too. What do we have here? I mean, this is crazy. And just to quickly summarize, pull something out of the way of my slide here. In the case of, just to give a little picture here of what we just looked at. Sorry about that, I'm just moving things around here. This, unfortunately, on my slides is messing me up. Okay, so I just pictured here what I just talked about. Here's the cell in the first instance. This cell here, this is a normal cell. all this business is going on here. The carcinogen, and that's the C, comes in, it gets metabolized by an enzyme, and then it binds to the DNA to give this damaged gene. And at this particular point in time, this is repaired under normal circumstances, or it goes on to form early cancers. And, and one of the first things that happens there, our body reacts in a way, it produces these natural killer cells, to knock out the early cancer cells. By the way, I'm going to come to this later. Natural killer cells are called T cells. This is about 35 years ago. Just recently, they've gotten all excited about T cells as if they're just discovered. I'll come back to that in a moment. So I'm just summarizing here. Let's go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all these stars. I finally got to a point. I said, wow, what's going on here? Which one of these reactions can we hit up with a drug? I mean, that's the pharmacologic approach. That's the way the whole drug industry works. They find a mechanism. They find some way to stop the reaction that they don't want to occur, okay? And so I finally got to a point here where I said, wait a minute. There is no mechanism. We just happen to have, I listed 10 here. There was another 2 or 3 I could have listed too. It was very clear that every time we looked for a mechanism, we found one. And every one of those mechanisms, whether the protein was increasing its activity or decreasing it, it increased all the activity that tend to turn on cancer. It decreased the ones that tend to turn it off. I couldn't imagine it. I mean, the odds of that happening, I finally got to a place where I said, wait a minute, this is wrong. There is no such thing as the mechanism, which is a bedrock assumption in the entire pharmaceutical industry. I'll come back to that later. I mean, what this showed me, especially when I started thinking about how these mechanisms all work together like a symphony, like a great symphony, and 1,000 times more mechanisms than this, 1,000,000 times more. Everything is working like a symphony. There is no mechanism, no specific mechanism. So that's the summary of mechanism. I want to show you now that, I just showed here too, that this natural killer cells these days are called T cells, by the way. They're working with them now just as if they were just discovered. This was done about 35, 40 years ago. So, okay, all that stuff is going on. Now, I want to take you to a next step in this little story. It turned out the protein we were using to increase cancer, and what the Indian workers had done too, by the way. The protein we were using was the only one that was generally available to researchers. It was casein. That's the main protein in cow's milk. I came from a dairy farm. Now, I think you can understand. I said, what in the world? Dairy protein, the main protein of cow's milk, turning on this cancer? Give me a break. This is crazy. So we tried a little bit later on a couple of plant proteins to see if they did that, and they didn't. We did it in many different ways. The plant protein, soy and wheat in this particular case, they don't increase cancer development, even when they're fed at these high levels. So here's something selective just for the animal protein. Now, let's stop there for a moment. I call those studies biological plausibility. It tends to show that the high protein diet actually increases cancer, and we know a lot about the mechanisms that cause this to happen. Now, I want to just jump into a different planet here for the moment. And I just actually gathered these data here not very long ago. Wait a minute, I lost my slides. The slides jumped off the thing. Sorry about that. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. But in any case, just recently, maybe 5, 6 years ago, I wanted to go back and see what is the relationship between animal protein consumption and various disease rates. Okay, this is work all done by others in past years. Let me show you some slides here that are just remarkable when you compare them all together. Here's a relationship between, let's say, I've got to go back one. I had one right here. This is a relationship between increasing protein intake. This is a screenshot, actually. The researchers showed that it was with increasing percent protein, they get an increasing rate of heart disease for all these different countries. Look at that line. I drew the regression line myself and using a certain algorithm. The line is a straight regression line all the way down, almost coming right down here at 0, 0. In other words, zero animal protein, no heart disease. Then here's one here. This one is a kidney cancer. Another researcher did this. Okay, the higher the consumption of kidney cancer, the higher the protein intake, the more kidney cancer. Again, a totally different research group. They don't even know each other. They're just publishing this, right? I drew a line through there, and that's what you get. Almost the same thing, the line coming all the way down to this XY origin, if you will. Okay, here's one for prostate cancer. In this case, they didn't say animal protein. What they said was non-fat milk, okay? Associated with, of all things, prostate cancer. Look at that. That's inarguable. That nobody will ever show the opposite. As we increase for these different countries, as non-fat milk consumption is increased, as skim milk, the higher the rate of prostate cancer. And we know quite a lot about that. But they called it non-fat milk. Now, non-fat milk, by the way, is basically nothing more than a protein drink. In other words, the milk has no fat in it. That's what, by definition, fat all is left is protein. So this is animal protein, increasing that. Here's another one, still another researcher. I happen to have known this in some years before he passed away, a friend of mine from Canada. But in any case, he was able to show that as he found increased saturated fat intake, then a higher the rate of breast cancer, death, breast cancer mortality. Again, a straight line. He called it saturated fat. But guess what? Saturated fat is a representation of, I don't know what's happened to my thing. That's a representation of animal protein. Now here's yet another one. Here's cholesterol intake versus coronary heart disease, Ph.D. We got the axes flipped here in this particular case. The higher the cholesterol intake, the higher the heart disease rates. Again, see that line? Come right now. I hope you see here there's similarity between all these sort of regression lines. Here's one for meat consumption, colon cancer. Each of these are separate researchers. They kind of published 60 years ago. I went back in the literature, was kind of bringing them up and recalling them in sense and finding the regression lines for these. Now we got meat consumption. Here's one for uterine cancer. This is total fat consumption for different countries and uterine cancer. What do we see in all these lines? All these lines are doing the same thing. They're regression lines. They come right back near the zero, which tends to say, as soon as we start eating some of these things that are all animal protein, we start to see disease risk. And we see a number of different cancers and heart disease here, if you will. So my conclusion from these studies is to say that cholesterol, when we consume more cholesterol and meat and total fat and low fat milk and saturated fat and animal protein itself, of course, these are all surrogates. My thing, I'm sorry, getting ahead of myself here. These are all surrogates for animal protein consumption. The researchers did not know that. The researchers focused on, skim milk is not good. Meat's not good. Total fat's not good. Low fat milk's not good. Saturated fat's bad. Look at all these here sort of representations that really took a life of their own. We've heard about them a lot about them now. They're not really just these kind of things. They all have one thing in common. They're all a representation of animal protein intake. Now, to go back, what about plant protein? One of those I showed you before, my friend from Canada back in the 1980s, he looked at the relationship between plant protein and intake of breast cancer, no relationship. So all those lines, those regression lines are just for animal protein consumption. So there you have it. What I showed you in the first few slides was the mechanism, a bunch of mechanisms all working together, unmistakably increasing in an experimental setting, unmistakably. Each one of these mechanisms being different locations in the cell and so forth and so on, working together to produce increased risk of cancer, but increased risk of other diseases too when you compare it. So I don't know, there's a lot more research. I could never give another 20, 30 lectures just on this subject, because this was the area I worked at, it was animal protein. The animal protein turns out not to be what we think it is. It's not what we think it is. And so I have been, running at some risk of my career for some years, talking about this animal protein effect. Of course, I'm going to go beyond that a bit. So today we're left with still this impression on the part of the public. Most people in the public, I would say, certainly the corporate sector and the medical sector, but everybody tends to think that protein is good. We need it. Yes, we do. But we don't need it from animals. Animal protein does this dirty work, quite frankly. Plants don't. plant protein doesn't. So I think we have a serious indictment against the consumption of animal protein. That being said, now we're turning your attention to something else that's happened. Namely, this is a representation of some information that was developed by the so-called Institute of Medicine, the National Academy of Sciences, a very distinguished group, who set the recommendation for nutrient intake of all different kinds. In this case, I'm just showing you the representation of protein intake. These are different levels of calorie. I'll show you in a moment what this means. Okay, so I got a line here. This is the scale or the spectrum of protein intake from 5 to 6% of calories up to 22% of calories. Okay, let's see what we learned about this. This was what was published in 2002. It has long been established since 1943, to be exact, that the minimum intake of protein we need for good health, and protein is necessary, we need protein, but the minimum intake that we need for good health is about 5 to 6% of calories. But that's the minimum requirement, if you will. And so in those days, the researchers just say, hey, this is not, let's set this up by a couple of standard deviations, just to make sure everyone gets enough of this important protein. So they set up around 9-10% or so. That came up to the number we call recommended daily allowance of protein. It's around 10% of calories. A lot of people have heard that in terms of grams per kilogram of whatever body weight, but it's around 9 to 10% of total calories. Minimum intake, recommended daily allowance, okay? It turns out, and this started way back in 1943 and kept being updated through the years. But in any case, today, the intake of protein is right here, as you can see. The intake is about, ranges from around 11% up to about 24, 25%. Some of us, are nearly carnivorous, and we're up here at the high end. This is the range of about 95% of our population, somewhere in here, this intake range of total protein, okay? It turns out of the total protein, 75 to 80% of our total protein average in our country, 75 to 80% of it is animal-based. So much of all this extra, we're consuming way more protein than we really should be recommended more than we need. We're up here. The average, as I say, is just up to around 17% or so these days. Now, look up in the left-hand corner. I just see this a little scheme here, just showing you all those things I showed you a moment ago, that all these different diseases, if you look at the relationship between animal protein intake and these different diseases, are all more or less the same. And all the diseases are affected like each other. I'm taking those plots here and I'm just plugging it on top of this. So what does this say? Here's our average intake of protein right here. And this is the range during which we see increasing rates of these diseases: heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and so forth, okay? This is superimposed on top of that. So we're eating all this protein we don't need, okay? And this is animal protein, and we are getting these diseases, not just because of animal protein, it's because of our desire to consume animal protein. And a whole bunch of things going on. But that's really what happens. As we increase the diet, having more and more animal protein in it, animal foods, the higher the risk for these diseases. Unmistakable. This is unmistakable. This is a huge volume of data showing this over many years. So one more comment on this here, I should say, is that whole food plant-based diets, whole plant diets, they provide enough protein. If we just eating plants alone, whole food plant-based diets, at a minimum, they got around 8-9% or so. Actually, a lot of them are up around 15, 16, 17%. And so that's fine, no problem. That kind of protein is not a factor. Not only is a protein not self-effective, but also when we're eating plants, as many of you may know, we're consuming a lot of antioxidants, crude fiber, and so forth. So it's a combination of a whole lot of stuff going on here, affecting a whole range of different diseases, all driven by this sort of almost supernatural, intensity that we have for consuming animal protein. It's supposed to be something special about animal protein. And that's really what it is. We got so encased in that kind of thinking for centuries, decades, over a century, that we end up eating the wrong diet. So with all that said, in 2002, this is very distinguished body, the National Academy of Science, I know it very well, I was on panels myself there, the one that set these numbers, if you will, they came up with something new for 2002. They said the upper safe level, they were advised that they should set upper safe limits of different nutrients. Okay, they did that for all the different nutrients. As I say, this is one of the most recent versions, 2002. Now it's 20 years ago. But in any case, they had the upper safe limit for protein, 35%. 35%. I'm showing you here that any kind of animal protein consumed up here, we got serious problems occurring. Why in the world did they say 35%? Okay, let me say a little bit more about that. I call it the mob power. These are distinguished scientists supposedly at the Institute of Medicine at the National Academy of Science. It's chaired by someone I know really well. He's a very major consultant for the dairy industry in the world, probably the major consultant, at least for a few years he was. He chaired the committee that came up with this number here, 35%. Made a big report out of it, 1,400 pages I recall, something like that. I've got the paper out. I called some of my friends on the panel and said, what in the world did you do that for? And they said they didn't do it. And so I learned that this 35% figure was not really established by the committee itself. It was established by the news release that was controlled by the person who was in charge of all this. It was established by the news release as an upper safe limit, and it was told in major newspapers all over the place. Don't worry, folks. We can consume protein up to 35% of calories, or eat all you want. That is basically a ticket to eat as much protein as you can, and that usually means to most people animal protein. So with this data, I just showed you prior to this, and I could show you tons more than that. Here they are coming along in the year 2000, 2002, saying we're not getting enough. We're not getting enough. Well, it just so happens that I'll come back to that a little bit later. That is driven by people there who have a conflict with the industry who stands to gain from consuming more protein, and that's the animal foods industry. Okay, let me just go one more step on that question concerning our belief in protein. Way back in 1924, by the way, protein was discovered in 1839. The name protein comes from the Greek word first. For some reason at that time, that's another whole story. But in any case, we started believing this really tremendous, that protein had this almost tremendous value. Finally, in 1924, a fellow came up, a professor at the University of Illinois, actually, with a method for determining the value of protein. He called it biology and value of protein. And he basically was able to show that the more protein that we consume that is actually retained by the body, more protein consumed that's retained, and they have a way of calculating that and measuring it, the greater the body weight gain. That's good for livestock production. That's good for livestock. I know that. I came from a farm. More protein gives a faster rate of gain for pigs and chickens, more milk and so forth. More profit for livestock, agriculture. And so what did that lead to this word here, high quality? So a lot of people subconsciously, a lot of people haven't even heard of this idea, but almost subconsciously they believe that the protein from animals is high quality. Plant proteins are not, because they don't have this high quality, that is less retained, okay? So animal protein becomes the protein to consume. If you want good protein, get it from animals. I'm saying that's nonsense, because it all has to do with amount retained. Yeah, body weight gain, if people kind of attracted to that idea, like to go a little bit faster, but that's another lecture or two. The fastest rate of growth in our children is in fact not the best rate of growth. The fastest rate of growth is achieved by consuming more animal food. Is crazy. So let me just show you now what we know. A higher retention of the protein increases the production of growth hormone. I showed you that in our research we did ourselves. A higher rate of protein retained increases the level of estrogen in the blood. More estrogen in the blood means more breast cancer and a lot of other things. The higher the protein retained, the greater the so-called production of these free radicals. Okay, more mutations, decrease in natural killer cells, decrease in DNA repair. So all these mechanisms here come from more protein being retained. Animal proteins retain more protein. Plant proteins do not. So animal protein, when we consume more of the protein is being retained, more than we need, and the wrong kind of protein on top of it. And it kicks off all these effects here. This is all published. It's not just imagining things, and not just hypothesis. This is real published stuff. All these mechanisms here are increased by the consumption of high quality protein, animal protein, increases cancer. Increasing higher retention of protein also increases blood cholesterol, total cholesterol, bad cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, associated with heart disease. By the way, that was discovered in about 1909. We've known that. It's not saturated fat. That's not it. It's not total fat. It's animal protein. It's a desire to consume animal protein. And that specifically was concluded in the early 1920s. It's animal protein that causes increase in blood cholesterol, not the fat. Okay, one more thing. Animal protein, more protein being retained, increases blood sugar too. And A1C, the measurement of diabetes risk, as many of you may know. So here's animal protein. More of the protein is being retained. It's got higher biological value. It's higher quality. Everybody hears that. Higher quality. You've got to have it. Okay, you can have it. You can have all these things here too, or go along with it. More cancer, more heart disease, more diabetes. How about it? Unfortunately, this information coming out in the last 30 years, I'd say 40 years, during the time that I've been involved in my research, no one wants to hear this. The scientists don't want to hear this. And even the authorities who are making judgment about how much protein we consume, they don't want to hear this. Let's put the question concerning high quality animal protein, that story to rest. And so here's what we get. This high quality animal protein that we all want, we just want this here. This is what we get. You know, they see the picture, chickens and pigs and cows now being grown en masse, if you will. But you know, if you look on the web right now, the big story about livestock production, it seems to me, a lot of these reports, is how are we going to meet protein demands in the future? Because around the world, people still want to get that high quality protein. They think they really need it. And so this stimulates these kind of industries. They play off that sort of narrative, that understanding, as if we need more protein. This is especially true among countries that have, until now, haven't consumed that much animal protein. So that being said, that is associated with sickness. That's associated with sickness. So what do we do with our sickness? Well, over the years, we've tended to want to use drugs, basically to control our sickness, okay? Let me just show you a couple of things here just to get you thinking. Here's the use of pharmaceuticals. The dollars spent per capita for drugs for different countries. We're the highest country in the world using pharmaceuticals. In other words, we would use all these drugs to resolve the sickness problems that we get from eating the wrong food. It's very clear. I can't see how anybody can really look at that and see anything different. The United States is the only country, too, in the world who advertises on TV direct-to-consumer advertising of drugs, prescription drugs. I say the only country. There was a second country, New Zealand. I was actually on a podcast with somebody interviewing me from New Zealand who told me that they're now changing that. So I think it's fair to say that the U.S. is the only country in the world who advertises prescription drugs on TV, advertises TV. And the FDA administration themselves confess on their own website that when they see these ads coming for new drugs, they see those ads about the same time as the public does. In other words, they don't get a chance to comment on them. Prescription drug side effects, we now know, is number 3. Some judgments, depending on how you count it, number 4. But prescription drug side effects are serious. We use the wrong nutrition, create sickness. Okay, we create sickness. Now we got drugs and want to fix this up. Okay, we're spending the most on drugs. We advertise on TV. Everybody buys into this narrative. Drug side effects alone is the number 3 cause of death, for crying out loud. So what does this all mean? I'm just looking at different metrics. This is a comparison of 39 of the Western sort of affluent countries comparison. Our life expectancy is quite a ways down the list here. We're consuming all this protein. All this protein. We use a lot of drugs. What are we getting for it? We sure ain't getting increased lifespan. This has been declining. During the pandemic, it declined even pretty sharply, according to a report I just saw a couple of days ago. So things aren't squaring. Something's wrong. So what's the rationale for drugs? Let me turn your attention for drugs. A little bit of the biochemistry. Keep in mind, I was in essentially the pharmacology community in the first 10, 12 years or so. That was my primary interest. Here, I'm going to just develop for your thinking. This is a scheme of showing reactions that go in the cell to deliver energy to us. We capture the sun's energy. Plants do that, by the way, in photosynthesis, as you know. And they capture that solar energy and convert it into chemical energy. And one of the first products that's produced in that chain of events is glucose, okay? And then this subsequently now loaded up with energy. The energy is in the chemical bonds. That's gradually broken down step by step by step on through here. We call it glycolysis, the first part, just in the absence of oxygen. This down here is in the presence of oxygen, Krebs cycle. Some of you may have seen this. When I was first on the faculty back in the 1960s, in fact, I actually taught this. I taught biochemistry for the biochemistry students, and it was quite exciting. In those days, we just had access to not a whole lot of this information. Pretty simple, a bunch of reactions, kind of exciting, actually, to see which step did what, and we could learn which reaction did what, and maybe learn something about the control things. So the energy from the sun, solar energy, in this miraculous, beautiful, natural thing called photosynthesis, the plants capture that energy, convert it into chemical energy, and then this is all for us, all for us mammals. I'm talking about non-human mammals as well as human mammals. We all do the same thing, which is rather odd. Why would we want to consume, why would this mammal, the humans, why do we want to consume other mammals to get the energy we can get ourselves? I mean, they go big and strong and everything else. It makes no sense on that score. Okay, some years and not too long, maybe 15, 20 years later, those reactions grew. Look at this. This is the chart. Now, this is probably only 1% of the reactions. You can't see all these. The reactions that go inside the cell is all this stuff here. This huge amount of reactions. Beyond, we can't even visualize it. The drug protocol. Now I'm going to speak to the question concerning the use of drugs. Here's how the use of prescription drugs are developed, how they're sold, how they're recommended. The drug protocol, right, to a large extent, not entirely, but to a large extent, it relies on the concept of targeted drug therapy. You may have heard that these days. Where if we could identify some reaction in this mix here that might have something to do, with forming something we don't like, okay, that's what I was doing. We're looking for the key reaction. Well, okay, let's say some researchers found the key reaction here. Okay, then we get some chemical to block that reaction. And what do we get with it? Maybe you can block it for a little bit. What do you get? You get a bunch of side effects. All drugs have side effects. That's why the third leading cause of death in this country, fourth, depending on how you count it, one of the leading causes of death in this country is side effects from drugs. One could do a lot better job with nutrition, not drugs. So the nutrition protocol or blue protocol, in this case, we got multiple nutrients, no side effects. Drug protocol, one reaction, one drug, multiple side effects. Down here, here's nutrition. Multiple nutrients, no side effects. How can one look at this and then keep a straight face? You can see the difference. It's huge. So let me give you an example. I just come back to the chart I showed you before. Some years ago, it was discovered that serum cholesterol, as I said, over 100 years ago, the higher cholesterol in the blood would lead to heart disease, right? So longer in the 1970s, 80s, or something during that period, they learned something about the synthesis of cholesterol in our body. We make cholesterol. We need cholesterol, but we make our own, okay? We don't have to consume it, by the way. We make our own. So it starts out with this little compound here called acetyl-CoA, which then goes through a series of reactions to eventually get serum cholesterol. And the thought was, and this is the pharmaceutical sort of idea, the thought was if we could find a reaction here in this stepwise thing, somehow to block it, maybe, that would be a good idea. Then we could take that drug and block cholesterol formation, which presumably leads to heart disease. It does not, by the way. It associates with heart disease, but there's something more going on with heart disease, not just the cholesterol itself. Anyhow, we look for something like this, along by the late 80s, statins. There we have nice industry now, a few billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars. People taking statins to stop cholesterol in the blood. What does it do? Statins have side effects. Why would we take something like that? This is probably the number one drug there is, I guess, from what I see. We've used statins for quite a while to block heart disease. And the results we get from that is nothing compared with what you can do. What Dr. Essett and Dr. Ornish have shown. You can actually reverse heart disease with nutrition, with a whole food-based diet. Okay, let me show you another example here, this mythological thinking that we have on drug development instead of nutrition. When referred to the Nixon's 1971 war on cancer, I was at that time very active in my research and I paid a lot of attention. I was in cancer research and I know something about this too, kind of interested in following it. Finally, after 30 years, 2004, okay, a couple of some Australian American researchers came along and said, hey, why don't we go back and look at how well all these chemotherapy drugs are working. Started in 1971. They had access to a load of data, a huge amount of data that represented about 22 different cancers and the drugs that were being used for those patients that had the cancers. They started to ask a simple question from this large amount of data. Hey, are these drugs working? Are they working? Well, the best way they had to estimate that, or one way at least, they thought a good way to estimate that was determine what is the 5-year survival rate of cancer patients taking the drugs. If the drugs are that great, we ought to be increasing 5-year survival, right? It increased it only by nothing. That seems significant. By nothing. In fact, for a lot of these drugs, I'm talking about cytotoxic chemotherapy drugs. These are drugs that are being developed to kill cancer cells, okay? So a lot of these chemotoxic drugs, all these patients over the years, they actually cause new cancers. The average cost of developing these kind of drugs, just one drug, $1.3 to $1.8 billion. That's figures of 2014. We spend a lot of money going down this road trying to figure out a drug to kill the cancer cells with this kind of result. Well, that sort of became known in the community, I have to say. It didn't make much news. It became known, and so the industry kind of shifted course a bit. They were coming up with immunotherapy drugs, and there's a whole new concept of some other kinds of drugs. But in any case, these are still being used to a great extent. So Nixon's 1970 war on cancer failed. It failed. It was very much hotly debated in the early 1970s. I don't have a chance to go into the history of that, what went on at that time, but it really was an attempt to, let's say, bring cancer under control. So the story went. Making more drugs, especially good drugs to kill them. Okay, so that's another example of just going for a drug to do something and we don't get much out of it. Let me turn your attention now to using that same thought. One chemical at a time doing this thing. I'm going to turn your attention now to nutrition. And let's say cancer in this case, another kind of cancer, and a nutrient in particular. Here in 1981, this report came out, and I got excited about that at the time because it kind of helped me to think through some of the things we were doing. But in any case, here's a plot, really interesting plot, a three-dimensional plot, as you can see here. And along this axis, here's non-smokers. Here's people usually smoking for less than 30 years, then more than 30 years. This is the one that really counts. These are the people who get lung cancer from smoking. Okay, look at here. See it? You go up here, more cancer, 30 years. Okay. Now look over the next axis here. They learned that when they happened to measure the amount of consumption of beta carotene, because at those days, beta carotene they were just learning kind of an antioxidant, made it be good, for blocking lung cancer maybe. So they did a study showing that people who consume more beta carotene, going from here to there, more beta carotene, look at this. The risk of lung cancer dropped almost the same level is non-smokers. I mentioned that one time, got quoted, unfortunately, about that time, got chastised by some colleagues who wanted to bring the smoking under control, and I agreed with them, quite frankly, because bringing smoking under control is a big deal. But they didn't want me to mention this anymore. Don't say this. Their study didn't get much play or anything like that. But in other words, people consume more beta carotene, less lung cancer. Where's that come from? Plants. So it's really an indication of plants. But nonetheless, some people in this business wanted to check out beta carotene itself. And they thought that if they put beta carotene in a pill, and this was a study done by a Finnish group and an American group working together, if they put beta carotene in a pill and then gave it to people smoking, maybe they could knock down lung cancer. Big study, actually, 29,000 male smokers. They're going to follow them for 8 years. They thought it was going to take at least 8 years to see any effect. It had to stop at 5 years. At 5 years, they measured the beta carotene intake among these people. People consume more beta carotene had less lung cancer. Look at that. It's the same as what I just showed you. Just to repeat. That's statistically significant. In 5 years' time, people eating more beta carotene, eating that kind of food, their risk of lung cancer was significantly decreased. People took a beta carotene supplement, increased it. To me, this is a bell ringer. This has been shown now quite a number of times in other mixtures too, and I was in position to see this in broad daylight. I was the representative of the Academy on a major federal trial on the claims being made by vitamin supplements at the time. It just came out. What this says is that this nutrient, beta carotene, wonderful nutrient, antioxidant, it's provitamin A, that's what it is. People consuming more of this here stuff along with all the other good things in plants, lung cancer down. People using a beta carotene supplement is up. You can guess yourself what you'd make of this. The food beta carotene consumed with all the other things, not just because of beta carotene, it's all the other things working. That's called holism. I like that word, the holism. With the, I intend for that W to be there. Reductionism, that's the concept exactly opposite. That's where we tend to work on one thing at a time. One drug, one nutrient, one disease. That's the name of the game for the entire medical industry. Reductionist. Nutritionist, holist. I like to think of nutrition being redefined. It involves multiple nutrients, multiple mechanisms for each nutrient. Each nutrient has an uncountable number of mechanisms. It's just a network of things all working together like a symphony, each nutrient. But there's a lot of nutrients, all working to create an effect on multiple diseases, along with multiple health improvements. What do you get out of that? This is my baseline after all this years of complexity and wandering in the weeds and through the swamp. I think what we first have to do is acknowledge the complexity. It exists. There's no way under the sun that we can reach in and pull that apart and actually create total health. So it's a whole food. That's my definition of what a whole food is. It's the justification for consuming whole foods. Let us consume the whole food with all of its nutrients. Let Mother Nature decide what to do with those nutrients. And that's another whole story. To do with those nutrients once we consume the food. So it's whole food, plant-based. That's what it is. And the animal story that I just told you, animal protein story, is that. Let's consume plants. Let's make them whole. We see spectacular results. When my son Tom, who I understand is presenting in this same program here tomorrow, but in any case, when he and I were doing the China study and back in 2002 to 2004, I was trying to put together the story, trying to tell this to the public, thanks to my wife telling me to stop complaining, take the science I was working on and complaining about it, go to the public. So that's the way it happened. And we were writing a China study, Tom and I were. And so I was interested as we put that story together to see if it kind of would work. I looking into the research literature and peering back, and I found a bunch of diseases for which there had been evidence produced at the time, incomplete evidence. The researchers didn't know it themselves, but sort of evidence that over some years, evidence had been arising. All these diseases here could, in fact, be prevented, if you will, maybe slowed down, suspended, and even cured, thanks to Dr. Esselstyn and Dr. Ornish and some others. Okay, whole food plant-based diet prevents, suspends, and cures these diseases. That's a big load of all kinds of different diseases. This thing wasn't just for cancer. It wasn't just for cancer of rats. It wasn't just for the cancer of humans. It was, you look at something really fundamental going on here. The whole food plant-based nutritional effect is broad. It's very fast. Anybody in this business will tell you, you can see changes in cholesterol. For example, when people are put on this diet, the cholesterol will drop like a rock in a matter of a day or two. So it's fast, just as fast as any drug. Furthermore, dietary intervention with nutrition, it reverses disease in a lot of cases. I'm going to change the word. I think that we can say it treats the disease. That word treatment should not be left to the community who are using drugs. We can use the word treatment in regards to nutrition with no side effects, as I showed before. What about viral diseases? This is a topic of the day. We all know that. We've been through this pandemic. I'm just curious. I got interested in the viral question many years ago, but more particularly a couple of years ago when the pandemic was first breaking. And we had virus diseases around. We know about that. They've been kind of nasty, creating some problems over the years. Some of them are more common, and less symptomatic, common colds, flu, and so forth. Some others are kind of big. Here's one here that we worked on in China, hepatitis B virus, and its causation of liver cancer. So, in any case, we're bringing it to some evidence we have on this one right here. They ask you a question about viruses. Why do viruses infect us? Why do some of them are sort of innocuous? They don't do anything particular. Some of them were kind of nasty. Is there some way we can control this thing? It's been going on for 1 million years, by the way. They were here for 10 million years before we were on this earth. So viruses have been part of our senior forever. So I'm just raising this question here. I'm raising it because, the pandemic, I'm going to stick my neck out and say this, we learned something. I'm just asking a question. Tell you about that in a moment. I'm going to tell you the story, my story, based on some data we collected in China. In this particular case, it was the second time we did that study in China in 1989. It included both mainland China and Taiwan. Anyhow, I'm going to talk about hepatitis B virus. This is a nasty virus. This kills around 800,000 people a year. That's pretty nasty, I think you would guess, for years. So the hepatitis B virus antigen, we call it, this is live virus antigen. It's called surface antigen. This virus is out here, it's live floating around, it's out in the community, whatever, where it comes from, maybe in water, maybe in the air, maybe blood flows or whatever. It's out here, it comes and affects the human body. It's coming into the human body. We test positive for it. We test positive. We know, in other words, the virus is present. That's all, a positive test, that's all it means. The virus is there. Okay? Now, that virus, when it comes into our body, wherever it comes from, or whatever virus we have, it can take one or two paths, more or less. One way, it can go and do its dirty work. In the case of hepatitis B virus, it's liver cancer. That's pretty serious. That's the fifth leading cause of death in the world, by the way. It's not a small item. So we got hepatitis B virus involved in causing liver cancer. It goes from an asymptomatic state to a symptomatic state, okay? The other way it can go, this virus, in theory, or any virus, if our body looks at it and says, I don't like that, we'll do something about it, so they can form antibodies, okay? Two different ways. This one here is serious, problematic, big problem. Coming down here, no problem, no problem. This came out of the study I said we did in China. Many of you may not know this, some of you will, where we actually had access to data for a total of at least 4 dozen different diseases for 2,500 counties all over the country. We found that the cancer was high in some places, low in others, huge differences. So that was the China study for those of you who may not know. We measured lots of things as to why these diseases are high in some places and low in others. This is just one for liver cancer, although I see I put on there breast cancer, but we got for liver cancer too. Okay, what do we find here? We measured how many people, in this case it was close to 9,000 people, We measure how many people were test positive for this virus, live virus, and how many people had liver cancer, how many deaths were caused by liver cancer. We measured how many people had antibodies, if you will, and then we had nutritional factors. We had to look to see what are the nutritional factors that cause it to go this way rather than this way. It'd be nice to know. Here's what we found. They say a serious disease, right? Around 800,000 deaths a year. It's not small potatoes. This is big. Okay, so 1989, 8,900 adults. We're drawing this scheme over again. This is what I'm doing in this case here to make it a little more simple if I can. Here's the infection occurring. But the infection, we're infected. We get the live virus. Okay, now we got the antigen. Now we test positive. Oh, we all get scared. We test positive. And so if it does its dirty work, in the case of this virus, we're going to die. Liver cancer. That's what they do in China. They die when they get that virus. It turns out, in the data we had, people consuming animal food, only 10%, mind you, of what we do in the West, just a small amount of animal food. They were the ones that allowed this antigen to cause liver cancer. So animal food is associated with liver cancer. Highly, highly significant. A small amount of animal food, animal protein, let's call it that, causes liver cancer. And in the process, we also took some of that information back to the lab. Let's say this was like 30 some years ago. I mentioned this before. We had a mouse model where they formed liver cancer and we fed them different levels of protein, the same as we did with rats and so forth. The animals given the higher levels of animal protein formed liver cancer. These were called transgenic mice. They were susceptible to getting liver cancer. So animals consuming more animal protein, they got more liver cancer. And interestingly, we measured also something new in those days. They're called natural killer cells. These are the T cells. These are the T cells. So we measured that. Thanks to a colleague of mine who told me about that. We got together and did that research. So the animals, the people consuming animal food, they get the liver cancer. Highly, highly correlated liver cancer. And we see in the animal study a decrease, a really sharp decrease in natural killer cells. Plant food, people consume more plant foods in China, okay? They formed antibodies and they did not get that liver cancer. Look at that striking dichotomy. Plant foods lead to antibody for this virus. What happens in one virus is that more or less they're all susceptible to the same thing. They all go through the immune system. So the immune system is able to handle virus rather nicely when it's healthy. Plant food keeps the immune system alive and healthy. Well, antibodies. Animal food, people consuming animal food, look what they get. Not a very good deal. We actually had access to a total of 11 so-called risk factor correlations. Now, some people get concerned about correlation. In this case, that concern does not apply. All these correlations were significant at that really high level of statistical significance, 0.01. 11 correlations, looking at this collection of these relationships led to the same, converged to create the same outcome. In other words, I am really confident of this. People consuming animal food are going to allow the virus to do its dirty work. People consume plant food in this model here, they're more likely to form antibodies and escape the problem. They'll still get the difference between people consuming animal or plant food in terms of being positive had nothing to do with anything. I mean, we all are going to get exposed to the things that doesn't matter. So anyhow, what happens? I published this 2 years ago. Just a year ago in February 2001. I have to tell you a little story about that. This is why I'm saying nutrition is dead on arrival. I published a lot of papers, and in this case, I published to a really major journal, sent it to them for publication. Now they have some sort of different subjournals in their package. This is the first thing that ever happened in my life. I sent in our results showing this, suggesting that maybe this has some relevance, for the coronavirus. They wouldn't even review it. They turned it down. They wouldn't even review it. I never heard this before in science. No explanation. We don't want to hear this. just because I had in the title, this result, question mark, COVID-19, just a suggestion, maybe we should think about nutrition in this case. That's what the stage is. Let me summarize you a little bit. Some of this you already may know. On the COVID-19 thing, this has been already pretty well established now. People who are getting the virus disease, the coronavirus disease, are usually over 6 years of age. Some younger people are not very healthy. The older people, they have more of the so-called comorbidity problem, more degenerative disease, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, obesity, stuff like that. And people in that particular category, are more susceptible to suffering the consequences of the virus. Okay, we know that. That's really pretty well established. So those who are having a comorbid conditions, like you can bet your life, they've had poor nutrition. And the figures I have is in excess of 90% of the people, the deaths from the coronavirus, more than 90% are coming from people who have comorbid conditions. They have heart disease, they have diabetes, they have this and that, right? So they get comorbidity, they got poor nutrition, that's been pretty well established. These in turn then are the ones who are susceptible to having a really serious disease severity. Do you know the whole food plant-based diet? We already know it blocks this. If you use whole food plant-based diet here, that make it good nutrition, right? You don't get this. But we learned from our data, both in the animal and the study in China, that the whole food plant-based diet blocks this too, in the case of hepatitis B. Now, merely suggesting that the same thing is likely to happen with COVID-19 too. Those who consume really good food, maintain a strong immune system, are tending not to going to be having this problem up here. They're not susceptible to the virus that comes around from time to time. They turn into a modest virus, into a deadly virus, perhaps. They have the condition. They have the soil for the virus to grow, kill us. But here, this is, we already know from this work, suggestion from work in China, that this will block this here reading at the level of the disease itself. We published that in February 2021. A little later, another group came along and did a study in a rather crude way. I mean, you can't measure food intake all that well in these kind of studies, but they gave it a try. And they found that people consuming plant-based and so-called pescatarian diets, they saw a 73% decrease in COVID severity. It's a lot. And this study is kind of weak in a sense. It's not very well, I mean, you can guess yourself, whoever says they're plant-based, maybe not be. And so this is a rough approximation, but even with that rough approximation, they got a 73% decrease. That was published. And since then, there's been 2 more publications that come along and so forth, okay? Kim and co-workers, Moreno, I think that was last September, somewhere around there. Another one I haven't seen yet. Here's what I'm saying. The nutrition has not been sold to the public, has not been told to the public in a way so they don't get heart disease. Not told them in a way, in fact, that they don't get cancer, especially in the way they get diabetes. The public is not learning about this. We have known this for more than 100 years. I could argue that it goes back considerably before that. In fact, I've got some other lectures going in history. It's fascinating. The fact is we have ignored nutrition, which is the process, there's the metabolic process by which food is actually used by the body in this marvelous way of everything being used together. We can't identify it by one nutrient at a time or one mechanism or one drug. It's all of it working together. It's nature. It's Mother Nature at work. That's what we saw in our animal studies I showed you early on. All of these reactions, we could have found a bunch more. Every single one did the same thing. They were located here, there, so many different tissues, independent, supposedly these different mechanisms. Somehow they were talking to each other. Just instantaneously, all working like a symphony. It was amazing. That's what nutrition is when we consume the right food. And I'm talking about the right food. It has to be plant food. It cannot be animal food. Plant food has just an unlimited number of substances, nutrients, that antioxidants and complex carbohydrates and all the rest. Really quite amazing. And by the way, these studies here have now since come out. Is anybody talking about this kind of information that nutrition might play a role in creating immunity? No one. No one. They talk about immunity becoming possible only by two ways. They talk about getting immunity from getting the disease. The other kind of immunity that they talk about is either getting the disease or it's maybe just something else. They call it innate immunity. They don't talk about the fact that nutrition, in fact, can play a role here. Just like they never talked about nutrition in heart disease. Just like they never talked about nutrition in diabetes. In other words, we live in a world where nutrition has been ignored, totally ignored. And we can't talk about nutrition in the context of one nutrient at a time. That's a lot of confusion. We can't talk about it in terms of one mechanism at a time either, like chemotherapy for cytotoxic chemotherapy for cancer drugs or statins for heart disease or a whole host of other kinds of drugs too. We tend to focus on one thing at a time in a big mixture. There's a big mixture that goes wrong, and big mixture is really what is created by good or bad nutrition. We eat the right nutrition. We have a good mixture there. Everything working together. I'm going to stop there because I think that, as I said, nutrition is dead on arrival. I've been really excited, positive, thinking, during most of my career, learning some of these things. I've really gotten to a point where, some now 20, 30 years ago, I really became convinced, more than that, I guess, when they started changing, but I know what it can do. I know what it can do to friends. I know what it can do to family. I know what it can do to creating an environment, an entire system of global health. A system of global health. Just imagine. Now we're living with issues concerning, the environment, big issues, climate change. The number one cause of climate change is livestock rearing, all because we want to eat that protein, high quality protein. What do we get out of it? We get disease. We create a huge series of ecological problems, of environmental problems. And we think we're going to escape all that by taking drugs. Never on your life. It's not going to work that way. We've got to turn to the role of eating the right food, for crying out loud, and recognizing nutrition for what it is. I have to sort of take the opportunity when I have it. I don't get any funny out of this myself, I have to say that. We have a certificate program, an online certificate program, now with Cornell University. It's science-based, it's continuing education credits. We've got world-renowned faculty, some of them who are speaking at this conference, by the way. And there you have it. And then I want to also bring up for your interest, possibly, because I started out with a very bad, dark title. Nutrition is dead on arrival. It's possible to go forward. And so this book was just published now in late 2020 with my grandson, actually, Nelson Diesel. And I'm trying to make the argument in there, or bring to the attention of people that there is a future for nutrition. There is a future for nutrition. And it really has to start with the idea that all these nutrients work together, and they work together not just to create or to have an effect on one disease at a time. Forget it. It's across the board, a whole variety of things. And so we live longer. We don't have to have the short lifespan. We live longer. We live far freer of the suffering that a lot of people do. And I'm just so convinced that this is the future of nutrition. We have to find a way. We have to find a way to actually communicate this to the public. And that means not only working at our own individual levels or different communities, which is a really, really big deal, maybe it's the best way, but somehow when we have the opportunity, we've got to speak out about the superstructure that we have at the systemic level, the healthcare system itself. We've got to be aware of what they are doing. They are trying to make money, and they couldn't care less about having nutrition. in the package. And that means no nutrition in the medical schools being taught either. Got to start there. Physicians who, may wish to use nutrition in their therapy, if you will, treating patients and so forth, and so on. It's not easy to get reimbursement for the professional services. It's got to be at the level, at least, of everybody else, all the other physicians too. So we need reimbursement for physicians. We need to teach nutrition in medical schools. And in my particular area that I'm really quite familiar with, the research that we do in this field, largely funded by the National Institutes of Health. There's 27 different institutes, one for cancer, one for heart disease, one for this. I mean, they funded about 90% of generously over the years because I guess they thought I was doing something different. But in any case, of those 27 institutes, there's not one called the Institute of Nutrition. So there you have it. I started with a dark title, a worrisome title. It's dead on arrival nutrition. We've got to change our thinking. It's not about the reductionist idea of looking at one nutrient at a time. Taking one nutrient at a time, that's not nutrition, that's pharmaconutrition. That's trying to twist nutrition into a pharmacological concept. It tends not to work. It's actually eating the food as it was made by Mother Nature. And she can turn around when we consume the food, disassemble it in our digestion or metabolism, disassemble it and turn it into reactions that could create an amazing, amazing response effect. Thank you.
Dr. Campbell, thank you so very, very much for coming back once again to The Real Truth About Health and for this amazing, amazing presentation. It means so much to so many of us. We're going to jump into a live Q&A session with you. And before we do, I just want to double check that everybody knows exactly where they can get your books. Where's the best place to go for your books right now?
Well, they all come from, you can get them on Amazon for sure. So all the books I have, the Future of Nutrition, I say, were kind of anxious. The book whole was my discussion of, first the China Statement came out in 2005, and then 2016, republication. And the book whole was came out in between. That's more of the theoretical discussion of that concept of holism, which I find so attractive. It's on Amazon, basically.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And so with that, we'd love to have our audience be able to give some questions to you. And I want to make sure that everybody knows exactly how they can go about doing that. So I'm going to just give a little instructions to my audience now, our audience. And again, for those of you that don't know, we typically don't take questions right from the chat box. We ask you to raise your virtual hand. And for those of you that don't know how to do that, and when you look at all of your Zoom tabs, one of those tabs is called your Reactions tab. You click on your Reactions tab. You'll see something that pops up alongside other emojis that says raise hand. You click on that, and we will see your raised hand, and we'll go ahead and take as many raised hands as we possibly can before 7 p.m. Eastern, the time when we start our panel tonight. So, folks, there's a whole bunch of you out there, and I'm thinking, how many of you would love the chance to intimately talk to T. Colin Campbell and ask him a question? Because this is your chance. Here it is. So, Dr. Campbell, if you're ready, I'll go to our first question.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that is going to be Steve. Steve, welcome. What's your question for T. Colin Campbell?
Hello, me?
Yes, you. Welcome.
Okay. Thank you, Ben. Truly an honor. Thank you. Thank you, Stephen Shore and the whole Truth About Health team for this opportunity. Wow. As for me, the real truth started with the China study. I read it as a guest on my friend's organic dairy farm, and I never looked back. Thank you. God bless you for what your work has done for me and scores of others. My question is about all the new technology, the dairy proteins that are yeast grown in reactors, that don't have galactose and don't have lactose, and don't have saturated fat, but they're bioidentical to whey. They're not tested. They're generally recognized as safe. The heme iron from GMO soy in the Impossible Burger, same thing. And or the mycelium-based stuff grown in reactors, are they any better? Or are these appropriate transition foods, or should we just try to skip them? Thank you so much. God bless.
Well, I think first off, I'd like to make a comment. I'm going to accept these people are really motivated, I think, to create a better world. And that's, they're hearing a message about the plant-based diet, so they want to create something that, doesn't rely on the livestock production scheme. So that's a given. It's difficult, though, to do that exactly right. It's at best a stepping stone into this better world. There's some of them are using, you mentioned the cell-based protein idea. I have problems with that. And the reason I do is because, as I understand it, the protein being synthesized essentially in, a glass vessel, whatever it is, tank, that these proteins being synthesized are derived from a template that actually makes certain kinds of animal proteins. Maybe a template of, whatever kind of animal protein you want to talk about. If that is the template to make the protein in these glass vessels, and nothing's made too much accomplished, because that kind of protein is going to have the same properties as the so-called high-quality protein from animals. Want to increase growth hormone, is going to do this and that stuff. It's going to grow cancer, it's going to cause cholesterol. So I don't have too much hope for that kind of approach, to be honest about it. I'm proven wrong, but I just can't, theoretically, I can't see it. Now, some others aren't doing that. They're using, of course, things like soy protein, legume proteins of various kinds, which is a step in the right direction for sure. They've got a problem they have to deal with, especially when they're using soy, which is, I guess, the principal protein they want to use. What is it? 90% of the soy being produced now is GMO. You got a bit of a problem. How are they going to wrestle with that one? So it seems like it's an opportunity to step in the right direction, good motivation in many ways, but doesn't quite get there. So maybe let's call it a transition food at best. What people need to do, though, is to recognize that when we're consuming whole food, plants in the whole food form, it becomes delicious. I came from a farm. Meat, milk, and eggs was our ticket in most of my early adult life. And that's what it was. It's a strong preference. You get that preference for it. So I can understand the difficulty people have in changing. It is. It's not that easy. But here's one little ticket I would say to that, to answer your question. One thing that I've become impressed with some of my colleagues who are doing these jumpstart programs, if people will stay on a whole food plant-based diet 100% of the time, really, really good, stay with it for a month, maybe 2, 3, something like that. What happens? Our taste preferences change. And when our taste preferences change, then we wonder, why were we ever eating that other food? I've done it myself. So coming back to your question again, the corporate attempt to create a better world by not using animals, I applaud them for that. That's not an issue. But they got some problems to wrestle with. Now, I don't know whether they're going to be able to solve more or not. I think the ones we're using the plant foods alone, already made, they're probably better off, even if they have to suffer the GMO consequences, which are kind of uncertain at the moment. Best I can offer.
Thanks very much for that, Dr. Campbell. And now we have Michelle. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Dr. Campbell. I'm such a hero. I've read all your books. I'm a graduate of your Institute of Plant-Based Nutrition. Whole was a book that really grabbed me in particular about the problem of the scientific approach towards nutrition, which you've touched on in this lecture. I'm wondering, despite the dismal state of how that research has gone in North America, are you aware of any other countries in the world where they have a better perspective on nutrition research that might be helpful for us, that we could look to as to be leaders in this in the future?
Yeah, it's the groups of people in the world who are the least educated, formally educated. the ones that live in the mountains, away from there, just living off the land. But that doesn't usually involve whole countries, of course. I've become quite familiar with a lot of countries around the world. I spent many, many years traveling all over the place. And in fact, the China study has been now translated into 50 foreign languages. So, and I've been, I don't know what it was, more than 30 countries lecturing. And so I've had a chance to sort of get an answer, try to get an answer to what your question is. Are there any of them that are more interested? There's an interest in this in every country of the world, quite frankly. Some of them are already doing it quite well in some ways. They suffer in other ways, but Africa, Asia, Southeast Asian countries, they're largely plant-based in some cases, especially in India, or so-called vegetarian. They're changing too, and in China it was the same thing. And unfortunately, in this whole business now, there's a worry almost on the part of some folks that we can't produce enough food, and that they mean by that animal food for the future, because so many people want to eat animal food. And so the countries that have been doing well and doing not realizing they've done as well as they have, are now wanting to kind of shift to get the animal food. There's a lot of marketing goes into that. But there are people, the Seventh-day Adventists is a community in this country. Obviously, the vegetarian group and vegetarian and vegan groups have this interest. I didn't get into this business because of that persuasion. I must say it was strictly because of science. But nonetheless, their motivation, as everyone knows, is good motivation. Let's be concerned about the animals, for sure. Let's do that. Let's be concerned about the environment. So there's a lot of motivation for doing this kind of thing. So we have these communities within countries that are doing it, and they are international in nature too. But there's no country that sets itself apart, I think, to say, okay, we're going to eat plant-based. None that I don't believe there's any, and I don't believe there's many really quite taken that step yet. I think it's going to be have to be an international effort. And I would argue that trying to argue the scientific case, even though it's difficult, a lot of people don't necessarily know the science. I just find that the scientific data is something that, everybody can look at. We can argue about it. The scientific data speak for itself. It's not personal. And so I like that. The fact that we're now using billions and billions of animals, slaughtering them just to eat their food, my God, that is so ridiculous. That is so insane. We don't need that kind of protein to start with. We surely don't need the energy that runs through the animals. I mean, they get their energy from the same source we do. We're all animals. Why do we have to grab onto their stuff? I don't know. I'm probably rambling here too much, but there's no country, yes, but there are some communities. They're growing. There's interest. What more can I say? We just have to keep at it.
Thanks very much. And you rant all you want, please. We love it. I'm going to move now on to Stephen V. And welcome, Stephen.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Campbell. I've met you once or twice or three times. I read your book, The China Study, about 12 years ago. I read all your other books as they came out, except for Low Carb Fraud. And I've made the transition. I grew up on meat and dairy, but the China Study really opened my eyes. Then I read everybody else. And I didn't find the transition easy myself because I liked the other food. But I'm 68 now and my health is better than my brother's. And I talked to them about it and they're not super interested. Their health are good enough. That's how they think about it. But I agree with everything you've done and I appreciate it. I just want to thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're still a young fellow. I'm 88.
We heard you just had a birthday. Happy birthday.
Thank you.
And with that, we will go ahead and bring in Mike. And there you go. Hi, Mike.
Thank you, Ben. And Dr. Campbell, thank you very much. During your discussion, it occurred to me that you used the word animal protein quite a bit. And early on in the discussion, you talked about how like saturated fat levels and stuff were surrogates for animal protein. So my question is, has there been any of the studies that you've seen, because you've seen so many, you've conducted so many, when we say animal protein, there's a wide range from animal meal, which is like chicken nuggets, all the way up to sushi grade tuna, that's animal protein. Has there been any correlation to the poorly or heavily processed foods versus the organic, like I said, tuna out of the sea in Japan that they cut right there at the table?
You got a couple of questions, I think, in that. First off, let me say this. One of my colleagues, my favorite colleagues of years ago, Tim Carroll, who did the breast cancer mortality study with fat and so forth. He did a study comparing a lot of different animal proteins. I think it was about 20 different animal proteins with about 20 different plant proteins. He did a little study comparing their ability to raise cholesterol levels in an experimental setting. And it turned out all the animal proteins raised cholesterol levels above all the plant proteins. So there was no overlap, which comes back to this question. Animal proteins are rather like each other. There are some differences. And given the probably technical differences that might exist in that study, nonetheless, animal proteins are also called high quality. Plant proteins are called low quality because they're missing an amino acid or two. So the proteins that are being used, wherever they may come from, animal protein is a problem. And I think the biggest problem about it is our worship of that concept that is high quality. So we want high quality. There's no question about that. That's survived a long time. And so I missed the first part of your question now. I don't want it too much. You were talking about
chicken nuggets are made with veins and cartilage and
right.
Tendons are all with it versus straight meat. So I'm wondering if some of those studies controlled for that.
No, they didn't, and I can tell you that in a broad brush treatment, there's no animal protein any worse or better than another, but they're all worse than plant proteins. That I'm entirely confident. And then it comes down to, you might say there's some differences between the way we prepare the meat, maybe fry it or what else we do with it. Broil it or something, I suppose you can see a little differences on that score. But as far as the native protein itself is concerned, whatever differences may exist, they're absolutely minor. And we can't trade off one for another. And that includes fish protein too, for the most part.
Thanks, Dr. Campbell. And up next we have, Sherry. Hi, Sherry.
Hi, how are you?
Welcome.
Good, thank you.
I wanted to thank you for your work and your presentation. My question is about your comments and about the nutrition being dead on arrival. And what I wanted to ask about is how much of that sentiment may be influenced by the political divide, especially in the United States. I know that the term soy boy has entered our vernacular, and that's a super negative, especially for men. My husband and I are now plant-based, but when we talk to other people, I sense that there's a resistance based on what feels to me like political leanings, and people don't want to be lumped in with a group that they think. Are you kind of following where I'm going with this?
Yes, very much so. And I'm very interested. Go ahead and finish.
Well, I mean, I have tried, and I guess I've been doing this long enough to realize that just giving the people the information, like you said, it's been available, doesn't move hearts. I think, I'm sure you're familiar probably with Earthling Ed and how he just starts talking to people regardless of their political affiliations or their background with, what they've been eating. And I just sense that, there's resistance to the information because people don't want to be affiliated with these groups that, perhaps it does mean they're going to have poor nutrition or they're not raising their children right, or they didn't vote for the right person. Does that make sense?
Yes, it's very complex, as I'm sure you know.
Yes.
All kinds of factors go into our political persuasions. But I think, there has been this macho element that's existed for, obviously decades, more than a century. And I think that tends to, if I can be so bold, without getting in trouble, that tends to be more associated with the right than with the left. But I myself, I don't want this to be confusing, my talk, because I like to be a scientist first and foremost, but I am a progressive, more on the progressive side of things, not always. I thought a lot about that question, and particularly in this pandemic time, as you know, everything's become so polarized, it's awful. And the whole question concerning vaccinations, for example, that's politically divided up. One side yes, one side no. But the one side who are so in favor of it, they never mention nutrition. But then again, the ones who are sort of opposed to it, they don't mention much about nutrition either. So I don't know. It's hard to walk that line and try to figure, okay, you're in this camp, I'm in this camp, kind of thing. The political persuasion, one part of the political persuasion, I will say, I'm really confident of on this point, those who favor very strongly the supremacy of the corporate model for advancing health, I say they tend to be on the right, but I'm just also persuaded that it's not just a conservative movement. That's a movement on both sides, and I find that very troubling. The corporate model, yes, we have a corporate model. That's what we live by. I'm all for it. I'm all free market, and that sort of thing. There's no question about that. But the role of the corporate world into what we get to know about nutrition and health in general, that is so powerful. The corporate world is so powerful. Now, if you can line up that sentiment with one party or another, more power to you if you can sort that out. But I think both sides participate in that game. And that's where the real issue is. Corporate influence controlling government, really what it is. We've got to find some way to deal with that, because they would rather leave things just as the way they have been, the way they are, because it makes a lot of money when you start working with the parts, like in nutrition or in medicine in general, drugs, nutrients, you start looking at the parts and you get intellectual property protection for whatever idea or entity you may have. You can get that. Now you're off to the races. You can make a business out of it, make some money. Whereas nutrition, you can't get intellectual property for nutrition. That's where the nature of the problem really lies. So the corporate world are interested in income, quite frankly, and that favors a certain point of view. And so I don't know. I can't. In my box, I can't decide. Okay, all is one or one all the other. Just sorry about
that. We hear you on that one, Dr. Campbell. And with that, we'll bring now Anne into the room. Welcome, Anne.
Hi, Dr. Campbell. Thank you so much for taking my call. I'm calling you from Toronto, Canada. I was diagnosed with stage 4 high serous ovarian cancer last year. I've been following your diet protocol. So far, my CA-125 numbers have maintained between 10 and 12. I'm just wondering, is there anything else I can do? Because if I speak to my oncologist, he doesn't know anything about diet and food. And he wants to do MRIs and CT scans. And so far my numbers are maintaining themselves. And I'm just happy to go along as it is right now.
Yeah, well, I get asked those kind of questions often. I'd like to point out, of course, I'm not a clinician, so I'm not registered to practice medicine, obviously. So whatever I say is strictly from from the book on the science side. And as far as the ovarian cancer is concerned, one of the things about that is the role of dairy as far as foods are concerned, animal food for sure. I think I showed a chart on ovarian cancer. I think we'll have one of those animal protein. So you're going in the right direction if you go over this other side, to the plant side. I think only good can come out of it based on the data I'm familiar with. It's true that oncologists, none of them are trained in nutrition, none, zero. But their fundamental premise for treatment is rest on the use of drugs and surgery and radiation, maybe. Those are all sort of very reductionist ideas. And nutrition is just too holistic for their liking. But the nutrition that contribution to cancer, either in terms of preventing it, sustaining it, or even reverse it, is about the same as it is for heart disease and diabetes and the rest of them. I can't put my finger on any one food, stick with this or that or something else. But just eat a good whole food plant-based diet. Don't add a lot of oil back, that's for sure. Because the most of oil is so-called omega-6, pro-inflammatory, and it creates problems. So even though that oil is coming from plants, when you take it out of a bottle like that, it's not the same. So I do know enough science to feel confident making that statement. And staying with the plant-based diet, no one can guarantee anything in this world along those lines, but your health will generally improve. It has for everyone else. So just keep going that direction. I'd like to hear it, if you don't mind, if you told me you saw some more benefit coming out of that idea. I'd love to hear it.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dr. Campbell. Up next, we have Kathy. Welcome, Kathy.
Oh, hello. Hi, Dr. Campbell. My question has changed as I've been waiting to ask it, but farmers are, kind of known as the salt of the earth, the hard workers. They get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and they milk their cows.
Online with the top doctor in the States in Albuquerque.
Oh, let's
and
hang
I
on.
told him about my cancer. I told him about your.
Oh, okay. We lost it. Thank you. Sorry about that. Go right ahead.
That's okay. Yeah, farmers are like, they get up at 4 in the morning and they milk their cows, they work their fields, they sweat hard, they work hard, they come in, they eat from their gardens, or at least this was what my grandma and grandpa did. And I'm thinking about how they would react if they were told that, your lifestyle is killing us, and we need to, do away with everything you've done, worked so hard for, and we got to switch to this kind of lifestyle. And they're one of, they're long since gone, but I have relatives who are still farmers, and actually they started out, they supplemented their farms lifestyles with working in the coal industry. And now the coal industry is going to be shot down, which I totally agree with. But having this argument with, or even a discussion with my cousin who is still on the farm is like, it's not, there's no communication happening, because it's like, this is my way of life. And so how do we even start to approach this for all the millions of farmers out there who will be personally offended? Yeah, it's killing us, but this is how they're supporting their families. What do you do to try to make this change that we need?
Well, you touched on something that for me actually is personally sensitive, to be honest about it. I grew up waking up in the morning at 4:30 every morning to milk the cows. I know the farm life as well as anyone alive, I'm sure. And so when I got into the protein question and discovering what I was discovering, that's one of the, that was one point that I just didn't think I could handle. How could I talk to my neighbors, my family, my friends, about finding this information? I'm very much aware of that because I love the farm life, great people, really sincere, good people. And so I didn't know how to, I mean, in my mind, it took me a few years to sort of get around to that. I had to change. I didn't see any way around it. My father, though, good weight. He was an immigrant from Northern Ireland. He only had a couple years education, and he was 100% farm as my grandfather all the way back. And so I was almost going against the grain of my own upbringing as well as my family. And I wrestled with it a lot, and I finally had to live with what my father told me when I was young. There was something that was above all of that. He used to say to me, he would want me to get education, and so much so that I had to drive just over 100 miles a day to go to high school, to go to a school that was half, better than a local rural school. But he used to say to me, tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. For him, that raised, that just was a centerpiece of his mind. So I often thought about that. If I saw something I didn't like, then try to prove it wrong. If it could prove it wrong, but if it still was there, I had to go with it. Farmers don't get that opportunity. I know that. But to get a little closer to home on that question, I think, I also know something else about the farm. It wasn't just raising animals. It was everybody had a garden and had a big garden. We had a big garden. My mom, she canned, and those days mostly canning rather than freezing because we didn't have freezers much. But she would can 300 to 400, cans of food. And so we lived on a lot of plant food too. Yes, I drank a lot of milk, and we did that sort of thing as well. But I know it's a tough one. It's a tough one. But I found that the one thing about the country folk that allows them to stand up and be counted, in this context, they really are honorable people for the most part. I really have a great love for the farmers. They were family, I should say, they're family farms. I don't have the same impression of factory farms. It's a different ballgame. Altogether, it's a different ballgame. And now they're producing the majority of the food in this country, and it makes me feel very sad. But if we want to translate what your grandparents did and what I guess I was maybe close to your grandparents' age, possibly. But yeah, we lived on the farm, and we worked hard, really hard, but it's always outdoors. My father, though, even though he did all that, he also ate a lot of meat too. He had a heart attack when he was 62. He died when he was 70. His brother died when he was 58. Their father, my grandfather, died when he was 73. So I figure always, heart disease on my side of the family is pretty strong. And that's one of the things that motivated me. I got to take this seriously. Well, now I'm 88. I should knock on wood. But in any case, it turns out that you can't get away from the facts. And farmers, if they're family farms, I don't know. That's the way of life, and that's a fantastic way of life. They're great people. And the biggest problem was the factory farms coming in, turning it all into a big machine, and everything is almost synthetic. And it's not the same. It's not the same. But I hear you big time. That the local farmer, the only they can do, they're honorable people, and you can just sit and be friendly with them. It's not them versus us. I'm one of them, by the way. It's just talking to them in a way that is personal. And say, well, here's what we found. You guys do it, try it. Kind of hang around the garden more than the cowboy. That's all I can say.
Thanks very much, Dr. Campbell, for that. And I'm going to go ahead now to Stacy. Stacy, welcome. Oh, I'm sorry, Stacy. I got to unmute you one more time. There we go. Hi, Stacy.
Hi, Dr. Campbell. I just want to thank you so much for your work. I am certified in your program, and it's on my bucket list to have you on my podcast someday. So I truly hope that I can speak with you, or at least meet you in person. My dad was just diagnosed with tinnitus, and I have been trying to tell him about eating more whole plant foods, of course. And this might seem kind of, I don't know, this might seem kind of like a dumb question, but out of all of the groups, out of the 4 things that I think that we should focus on, right? Like the whole grains, the legumes, the vegetables, and the fruits. What do you think is the most important for somebody who is kind of unwilling to budge in their diet? Out of those 4 things, do you think that fruit is the best for anti-inflammatory, decreasing inflammation? What do you think that I can help him focus on the most?
Well, you may not like this answer because I know you'd like to have a more specific answer, but it really is the variety of those plant foods that make the big difference. It's important to have some of all of them. And we're all different too. And so everybody has their preferences, I say, for fruits, obviously. Grains, I mean, whole grains are better than the polished grains, obviously, or white flour, refined flour. It's the whole grains, it's the fruits, obviously the vegetables and legumes. The whole 9 yards. Everybody, if they look at that total collection of all those different kinds of foods, I think most people can find something in that collection and get a little bit of all 4. And I can't say that just eating one is going to be any special treat compared to others. I mean, if there's one in theory, scientifically, I guess, you could argue that the leafy vegetables is about as good as it gets. It's loaded with antioxidants and fiber, obviously, and they're the agents that capture the sun's energy to begin with. So it's kind of a little special in a way, the green leafy vegetables. But then you need a good source of energy too, without getting into the fat, and that goes in the grains. And if you're going to use grains, kind of stay with the whole grains. Whether it's brown rice or whole grains, mixture of them too. Staying away from added oil, that's one thing. That's not a good thing. But otherwise, a variety. I don't want to put my finger just on one thing and say, okay, that's the trick. Because most people, they don't care for this, that, all that much at the moment. If they play around a little bit, they'll find something. I think they'll like.
Thanks very much, Dr. Campbell. We're starting to bring this to a close. I've got a question for you before we jump into tonight's panel. Brian Clement says that modern fruit has been hybridized to be sweeter than it would be in nature. He says it feeds yeast and mold and fungus and cancer, and that for years they studied blood under a microscope and came to these conclusions. And I'm wondering if you agree with that.
That the modern diet, the modern plants are hybridized.
Yeah, modern fruits specifically. Yeah.
Yeah, I know Brian quite well. He's been very active in his wife, and have been at their place and have a great deal of admiration for what he's been trying to do over his career. I actually share some views with him on that. The hybridization is a speeding up of the evolutionary process. And evolutionary itself, took a kind of transition over time, and we all, as part of the great life system that we live in, we kind of adjusted to as we went along. The hybridization of plants is a really rapid change, even if it's natural. Take this and that. But I don't see the data yet that shows that the hybrid varieties are as big of a problem is what some people might say. Some of these hybrids are synthetic. They're GMOs. They're genetically modified, as you know. That's a different story. I don't want to include that in the book. I'm just talking about, cross-pollinating some foods sometimes to get a little better growth and stuff like that. I don't know whether Brian's talking about that or not.
As far as I know, just specifically about hybridized fruit, but hard for me to say specifically. Yeah.
Two kinds. One kind you do it synthetically, genetic modification. The other way you do it sort of naturally.
I'm certain he's not approving of any of the GMO stuff, but I think he's seeing it in a natural way as well. So
sure.
Well, I'll tell you what, I have another question for you. It's coming in from Alejandro. Let's go ahead and unmute. Hi, welcome.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Campbell, for sharing your time with us and all the work that you're doing for humanity. Really appreciate it. I did read your book, The China Study. Great book. I've been studying nutrition now for about 8 years, and I'm studying to become a certified health coach. And what advice do you have for somebody that already has a good background and foundation in nutrition and plant-based eating, veganism? What advice do you have going forward for just making the biggest impact on humanity that I can as an individual?
Well, there's quite a lot of organizations now starting up around the country. Possibly might want to join one of those. My oldest son has a thing called Plant Pure Communities. There's a variety of local communities, and we at our center too now we're having an outreach of actually around the world with different centers. And then there's a lot of friends, a lot of my colleagues have things going to join up with a community group. It's really about communities too. Work at the local level as much as possible. If you can work at the state level and be effective and you're happy about it, go for that too. But a lot of people don't care to do that. I think if you can do something, there's a lot of things you can do. I know we just gave out a bunch of micro grants around the world, actually. My daughter was head of that, the Center for Nutrition Studies, and then she had them back talking about what they're doing. It's amazing that the intrinsic talent the human beings have, especially when they get together. Everybody can think up their own way of promoting this idea. So community-based, that's big, community. And then a jumpstart. These jumpstart things, a lot of people are starting into that. Get a bunch of people, switch their diet, and you work with a physician. They need to be, have physician association with this. Put them on this diet. Let them do some labs, cholesterol and a few other things. Let them do that. Do it for 10 days, maybe 2 weeks or so, and then let them see their own results. That's very effective at an individual level a lot of times, but at the same time, unfortunately, even those people don't stay on it because our whole society is so awash, in this stuff that comes out of the boob tube, and on the labels on food cans and stuff like that. My God, so it's hard to get away from it. But local level, I think that's probably one of the biggest things. Work at the local level as much as possible. With your training, I'm sure that would go over probably as well as anything.
Excellent, Dr. Campbell. Thank you so much for that. And folks, that's all the time we have for our Q&A session at this time. It's time for us to move on to our evening panel. And before we do, T. Colin Campbell, I want to thank you so much for coming back year after year with us. And of course, for being here today and your wonderful presentation and being so gracious with your time with our Q&A session as well. And I have to say, I'm not the only one that wants to thank you. So we're going to have our tech team unmute our entire audience. And I know they want to say thank you as well. What do you want to say, everybody?
Hey.